Today we're going to be covering the gameplay of Old World Blues, and so far this has been one of the more interesting sections for me with my previous DLC reviews. Dead Money had a lot going on with its gameplay to the point that I had to use a completely different format with that review series, dedicating a whole video to the combat and covering the more environmental and tertiary aspects throughout the adventure. Meanwhile, there was so little to say about Honest Hearts that I reconsidered even making the gameplay section its own video to begin with. Also, I'm just now realizing that I've switched the gameplay and main quest parts in this series from how I had it with Honest Hearts. You will never be able to unlearn this. Gameplay is a fickle thing in New Vegas. The game fluctuates from having so much to so little to say depending on what exactly it is that's being analyzed, and the overall quality is a mixed bag of extremes, from stellar RPG mechanics and clever design choices to downright archaic combat systems that leave a lot to be desired. Old World Blues is very much in a similar ship in that certain aspects of it stand out as pretty damn good, while others, well, we'll get to that. Starting out with what might be the single best facet of the gameplay, the variety and quality of the loot puts all three of the other expansions to absolute shame. Dead Money had some really cool gear, from the unique assassin suit to the common but still incredibly useful police pistol. Honest Heart's mixing quality is exemplified in the armor, from the pathetically unlikable armors of the different tribes to the unique and utterly kick-ass ranger set that can be found in one of Randall Clark's campsites, and not to mention Joshua Graham's outfit. Lonesome Road has some pretty badass gear, such as the Rocket's red glare and the unique riot gear variant of the ranger armor, but it's also pretty limited, not offering quite as much as Dead Money in regards to the more basic weaponry. Though I suppose in fairness, Lonesome Road is meant to be an endgame gauntlet for only the toughest couriers, but we can't talk about that yet. Old World Blues, on the other hand, has a lot to offer in terms of loot with a wide variety not only mechanically but aesthetically. Let's say you're a melee and unarmed focused courier. I'm going ahead and lumping them both together, since most players are going to be extremely high level by the time they reach this DLC. That is, assuming they're playing them in order. There's the Saturnite Fist, a variant of the Power Glove which can be heated up using the world's angriest toaster to deal bonus damage, resulting in the world's hottest and most painful fisting imaginable. There's the Antenna Array for those of you looking to go full Unga Bunga, the Proton Axe, which might just be the most badass melee weapon in all of Fallout, and the Scientist's Glove. It's literally just a glove. That is the joke. There's also a baker's dozen of energy weapons to find throughout Big Mountain, including a sonic emitter which can be modified to have a variety of effects, and even a variant of the Tesla cannon for those looking to make a big splash. But for those with a less sophisticated palate, rejoice, for we have the K9000, a machine gun with a dog brain connected to it, and even a damn voice box that will growl at the presence of enemies. Oh, what's that? The dog's gun is just not good enough for you? Alright, asshole. How about a variant of the sniper rifle once belonging to Christine Royce? Wait a minute, I thought she specialized in energy weapons. Then there's the armor and clothing sets. The Valence Rad-Eye Accentuator grants healing at a rate of 1 HP per 5 minutes, or 12 HP for every in-game hour, as well as an endurance boost. That might seem like rather slow healing, but it's worth noting that the healing also occurs during sleep and waiting, and it can synergize, at least somewhat, with other methods of healing such as the solar-powered perk and the healing implant. The stealth suit looks good, has solid stats, and can grant additional bonuses by having completed the optional stealth missions. Hell, you can even find the Ghost People's hazmat suit, and the headset has its own visual filter. Thankfully for us, we can't wear this in the Sierra Madre, so erosion of the joints is a non-issue. I mean, I guess you could add it to your inventory via console commands while in the Sierra Madre, but that's cheating. I could keep going, but I think I've made it pretty clear that Old World Blues has some pretty excellent gear. That is, unless you're playing an explosive character build. Hopefully this doesn't make me sound like too much of a boomer, but I love to turn one enemy into 100 enemies. My explosive character build was a blast, pun fully intended, to use in Dead Money, and I thoroughly enjoyed terrorizing Zion, whose residents had no way to defend themselves whatsoever. So I was excited to use an explosive build in the Big Empty given the tougher enemies of the DLC. But before I started the DLC, I took to the wiki to see if there were any unique DLC exclusive explosive weapons that would suit this build. Much to my dismay, there were none whatsoever. Thankfully, Old World Blues lets the player start it with whatever gear they want, so I at least had the freedom to start with whatever weapons and ammo I wanted. I chose the grenade launcher. And of course, the Fat Man. Unfortunately, with explosive ammo being rather heavy in hardcore mode, I could only go with so much, but the added difficulty to resource management felt appropriate for hardcore mode. What didn't feel appropriate was the amount of ammo I had to expend in each encounter. Alright, look, I get it. I'm at a high level. I'm playing at the highest possible difficulty. Enemies are going to be tougher than your average bloatfly, but the Fat Man is supposed to be one of the most powerful weapons in the game. Well, hey, that's the final boss of the DLC, I hear you say. Okay, fine. Even if I were to grant you that, watch this footage of me fighting the most common enemies of Big Mountain. I understand that due to the nature of RPG mechanics, enemies on these settings and at these levels are going to have a shit ton of health. I don't need the game to play like Hitman where a single headshot from any weapon means an immediate kill. But when it starts taking this many explosives to kill basic enemies, the combat is going to become more monotonous than anything. At least with melee you can incapacitate enemies, but then it's just a matter of wailing away at a ragdoll incapable of defending itself, and that gets pretty tiring, regardless of how hilarious New Vegas' ragdolls are. Dead Money's Ghost People were an awesome set, but the lack of variety was noticeable, and there was definitely a sense of repetition to the encounters, even with that consistent tensity. Honest Hearts was just plain boring with its selection of enemies, basically utilizing reskinned and repurposed assets from either Fallout New Vegas or Fallout 3 for the entirety of the DLC. It's so refreshing to have such a wide variety of enemy types in Old World Blues. You have plenty of reuses from the base game, such as the Protectrons, the Spore Carriers, Cazadors, Ghouls, and the Lobotomites are basically just reskinned raiders. But then you have the new enemy types, such as the Robo-Rad Scorpions. Sure, they're technically reskins of Rad Scorpions, but they also have fucking laser beams, and they explode on death, so you can at least give them that. They also come in packs, typically in an ambush where the player reaches specific points of progress in the main quest, meaning they'll often be encountered amidst other enemies as well. Also, not every creature in the Big Empty is a friend of Mobius. Sometimes even hostile enemies will fight alongside you against the Robo-Rad Scorpions, which is a pretty cool way of keeping the combat relatively fresh. Having the perk Animal Friend guarantees this as well, as there are a number of Night Stalkers prowling the Big Empty. One issue I do have with the Robo-Rad Scorpions, though, is just how damn perceptive they are. It was really jarring. I wouldn't call this a flaw, but holy shit. I'd get it if these were a specific kind of enemy like the Coursers in Fallout 4, but how exactly do these things catch me so easily? Then there's the kick-ass Y-17 Trauma Override harnesses, which have to be among my favorite enemy designs in all of Fallout. Remember the astronaut suit with the skull from The Thing's promotional material? This is that, but red. They come packing a variety of energy weapons and can prove pretty dangerous in numbers. What's interesting is that they don't count as robots or power armors, so EMP weaponry doesn't have any unique effects on them. They're just a bizarre group of enemies, and they do a stellar job at illustrating the darker elements of Big Mountain's research. And I fucking love them. Add to that the unique enemies such as Stripes, this adorably small Deathclaw Alpha, the giant Robo-Rad Scorpion with way too much health, and a goddamn legendary Bloatfly, and what you ultimately end up with is a healthy and varied selection of appropriately challenging enemies. Or at least they would be if their health pools weren't the size of fucking kaiju. Look, I'm cool with the legendary Bloatfly having a shitzillion health, it's appropriately silly for a hidden boss in a DLC as wacky as this, but common enemies? Maybe chill out a bit. Something I have to credit this DLC for would have to be the map itself. Big Mountain is very much structured like a theme park, with the pace of exploration basically boiling down to going from one laboratory to another to see what wacky and horrifying experiments that location contains and looting it for some unique gear. I'll hold off on talking about the locations themselves in detail for later parts, but what's important to note here is that this establishes a rock-solid pace for exploration, allowing players to explore each location to their heart's content before deciding on where else they would like to visit. The map itself strikes a fine balance with its size. It's not so big that the downtime spent between areas will bore the player, but it's not so small that everything feels awkward and too cluttered. Even the edge of the map has a purpose. Typically in Fallout, the map is edged with an invisible wall to prevent players from going out of bounds. It's an understandable concession, but feels low effort to say the least. Old World Blues takes full advantage of its science fiction roots, and surrounds Big Mountain with these electrical pylons. Canonically, these pylons futz with the Tesla coils that were used to replace the lobotomite's brains, so when a lobotomite would wander outside Big Mountain, they'd be rendered unconscious and teleported back to the think tank. This of course applies to the courier, giving the player a method of fast travel back to the think tank aside from the typical fast travel method via the Pip-Boy. That might sound redundant, but what's important to consider is that the player can't fast travel during specific circumstances such as an overencumbrance of their inventory and being near enemies, which will be a recurring thing given that Mobius sends his Robo-Rad Scorpions to ambush the player whenever they finish a main quest objective at the facilities bordering the Big Empty. This is great for any player struggling to survive and needing a quick method of escape, and the placement of the 3 main quest facilities ensures that this is a viable option for players that learned it through their dialogue or through the gameplay and thought to use it to their advantage. Not only is this useful for the player, but it's a clever way of repurposing something that the base game struggled to account for. Dead Money and Honest Hearts were smart enough to have canonical reasons for the player's inability to travel out of bounds, the formers being the structure of the villa itself, and the latter being the fact that it took place inside of a canyon, one that exists within the real world that you can go and visit for yourself. Old World Blues could have very easily settled on just having a wall surrounding the map. After all, Big Mountain's a crater. But Obsidian opted for a more unique and clever approach this time around, and it really paid off. Big Mountain also plays around with verticality, not quite to the extent of Honest Hearts, but I would argue more effectively. Throughout Big Mountain are these pipes connecting various facilities to one another, and these can be used to gain some elevation that's inaccessible to enemies. Of course, this also means leaving oneself open to ranged attacks from enemies wielding guns, so it's not guaranteed that the player can get out of harm's way completely unscathed. It does ensure, however, a strong vantage point for players looking to pick off targets with a rifle or with explosive artillery. That being said, one strong suit the New Vegas AI does possess is the ability to recognize when the player has reached an inaccessible elevation, as enemies can't jump and they need a way to account for this. This means that most enemies will retreat, either to find a vantage point to attack, or to find cover should they lack any ranged options. This means that couriers looking to fight back will need to be able to effectively pick off their enemies, or be able to flush them out of cover. Couriers looking to retreat will be in luck, though this does mean sacrificing potential loot and XP, which is always worth considering. On the north end of the map is the Botanical Garden, a plateau surrounded by cliffs with caverns that go quite far down, allowing for a number of different methods of approach. One could simply follow the caverns, or one could make their way down the cliffs by falling onto the rocks and crystals jutting from the walls. Next to the Little Yangtze camp is a perfect vantage point to snipe nearby enemies. However, this also means leaving oneself in a position that has little to no methods of escape and is noticeably cramped. Little Yangtze is also filled to the brim with ghouls, an enemy that is known for rushing the player down. One of the first locations that many players are likely to visit is the X2 Array, a tower with a spiraling staircase with an exit running along the neighboring cliff, allowing the player multiple options for handling the Robo-Rad Scorpion ambush that occurs during the main quest. The legendary Blowfly's Cave is structured like an arena with the player entering from the topside walkway, thus granting them a vantage point that also permits maneuverability should the player need to take cover at a new spot. All of these examples aren't particularly strong on their own, but they add up to make for a fun, well thought out, and varied experience. And that's probably the best way I can describe the gameplay of Old World Blues as a whole. It definitely isn't without faults. The absurd amount of health enemies possess is egregious and infuriating and kills the pacing of fights, but the more positive qualities of the overall experience do a pretty good job at offsetting the more frustrating aspects, so I can't exactly call it subpar. In fact, I'd say it's pretty good. Not great, but definitely good. The next video is going to be covering the main quest, a topic that I've been eagerly anticipating as the story of Old World Blues is, well, let's say interesting. So far I've been enjoying this and I hope you all have as well. I'll see you again soon, fellow lobotomites.